Thank you so much for joining us. I'd just like to begin though by acknowledging that I'm attending this panel on the traditional lands of the Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the enduring connection that our First Nations peoples have to country, to knowledge, to culture, and to story. I'd also like to extend my respects to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are attending from other countries tonight as well. So as I said, yeah, I'm Sian. It's an absolute pleasure to be representing the Melbourne Women in Film Festival as a co-presenter of this panel. Every year, our festival aims to platform and showcase women and gender diverse filmmaking from across Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. And that's past and present, which I think is really kind of ties in quite perfectly to tonight's discussion. I'm not going to say any more except to introduce one of our co-presenters, the president of WIFT Victoria, Lauren Simpson. So over to you, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Sian. So I'll keep it short and sweet for you tonight. WIFT Vic are thrilled to be partnering with Melbourne Women's Film Festival and Power of Post to bring this event to life. We know that the current climate doesn't permit us to be together in person, but just seeing your faces, or some of your faces tonight, has certainly brought a significant amount of joy into my life. So thank you, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Historically, women have been perceived as being better at working in roles where they're seen and not heard, and we all know that this is a load of crap. And I also know that I don't need to wax lyrical to all of you about how unacceptable gender bias is and how over it all of us are. But I will say this incredible conversation that we're about to partake on is one of the many ways we can learn from history, give voice to unseen trailblazers, and take control of our narrative as women. The team at WIFT Vic are working really hard towards a series of online conversations, case studies, and other events that will continue to advocate for and strengthen the presence of women identifying people in the screen industries. So if you're not a member yet, please consider becoming one and keep an eye on our social channels for what's coming next. But for now, it's my absolute pleasure to pass you over to Cindy Clarkson, the chair of Power of Post.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Sian. I'd like to acknowledge everybody's contribution to this evening, including Margarita, who's a POP and WIFT committee member, because she's never exhausted. I'd also like to just do a very quick plug for Parapost. Parapost is an overarching or umbrella organisation for post-production in its entirety. So we represent all departments, and we're keen and interested to elevate voices, mainly of people who identify as women. We're looking to generate and create equality in diversity and in gender. So without further ado, and with a whole bunch of 52 people here, thank you very much for all being here. I'll pass you on to Julia, the moderator.
Thank you very much, Cindy and Lauren and Maggie and Sian, for organizing this panel and inviting me and Karen Pearlman to talk about Karen's work. And welcome to and thank you to everyone who are joining our conversation now. It's a big pleasure for me to be part of this conversation with Karen, who is my colleague and friend, and we share a lot in terms of our research interests. And these interests include our fascination with early Soviet cinema and specifically with montage culture. And at some point, we realized that we are probably the only two scholars who are doing this kind of research in Australia. So naturally, we bonded. I guess what unites us is the fascination with the rich experimental culture that emerged in Soviet Russia in the 1920s, and which included movements as different as constructivism, productivism, futurism, and so on, which in different ways explored an astonishing range of aesthetic strategies. And I think it's important to keep in mind that these aesthetic experiments took place in the context of the October Revolution, which in itself was another experiment, social and political experiment, aimed to produce a new collective society, a new kind of people, produce a so-called new man and a new woman, which is relevant. And I want to emphasize this connection between social and political agendas and aesthetic experiments, because I think it's fundamental for our understanding of the potential of the period, and more specifically for the understanding of the role of editing in cinema, and for grasping why Soviet montage is such a loaded term. And this is because I believe montage is never just a formal strategy for early Soviet directors and editors. It is always also a meaning-making analytic. It's a meaning-making tool. And for this reason, our second important point of connection with Karen is interest in how cinema intersects with and mobilizes human cognitive, psychological, or even neural potential, the potential of our brain. So we believe that this period, due to its experimental agenda, is still very relevant to a range of debates. Debates about editing, debates about meaning, and debates about subjectivity and cinema. So we treat this period as an archive, and I want to quote Frederick Jameson at this point, who suggested that this period represents something similar to the classical heritage of Greece. And he says, more or less, this period is equal in duration to Athens' golden age. And it's precisely that golden age of the European left to be returned to again and again with the most bewildering and fanatical, productive and contradictory results. And that's what we do. We come back to this massive archive of experimental work to examine and re-examine it. My interest centers on theory and practice of Sergei Eisenstein, and Karen focuses on a range of figures with a rather strong agenda of feminist re-examination of history. For she noticed that standard lists of great Soviet montage masters traditionally comprised only men. So we have here Sergei Eisenstein and Dziga Vertov, Lev Kuleshov and Vsevolod Pudovkin, but we rarely, if ever, see any female names mentioned. And yet we know historically that women were absolutely fundamental for how cinema functioned at the time in the Soviet Union. And Karen addresses this issue, addresses both through her writing and through her films. And today we're going to talk about her trilogy, which comprises 3 films, A Woman with an Editing Bench, After the Facts, and I Want to Make a Film About Women. So my first question to Karen is, what prompted you in the very first instance to create this trilogy? And what kind of ideas or arguments you wanted to put forward while making these films?
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. And that's a really fascinating introduction. Julia, just makes me think of so many things. But as far as my kind of immersion in this period and the women of this period, it really began because I was a dancer. And then when it was time to quit dancing, I became a film editor, and I went to AFTRS and was doing my MA in editing through a series of events that had to do with teaching there and winning the Screen Studies Prize and things like that. I eventually ended up being the head of Screen Studies at AFTRS. And of course, when you're head of Screen Studies at a major film school, you have to screen Men with a Movie Camera. I mean, that's just required, right? So I would screen Men with a Movie Camera, and I would kind of make a little joke to my students, hey, you know, shouldn't it be called Woman with an Editing Bench? I mean, the reason we all remember this incredible documentary from 1929 is because of the incredible editing. So haha, shouldn't it be called Woman with an Editing Bench? But, and you know, as I got further into it, I found out that that in the film that you're watching, Man with the Movie Camera, there is an editor on screen editing. And that woman editing the film that you are watching is Vertov's, the director, Dziga Vertov's wife and lifelong collaborator. And then I started to think, no, this is not a joke. This really should be called Woman with an Editing Bench. So that's kind of where I tipped over from being, you know, from editing to, and just being curious to being really having a very kind of committed interest in looking at this. And of course, it's the editing itself is completely seductive and important to me, because the editing, you know, the Soviet montage era is that moment really when editing stops being just joining the ends of reels together and becomes an art form. And to me, it's a very choreographic art form. It's a very kinetic art form. It's all about movement. It's all about rhythm. And the Soviets, you know, none better than Vertov and Svilova really just focus in on that and bring that to life. So that's where it started, was with, you know, wanting to pay homage to Elizaveta Svilova in Woman with an Editing Bench. But then the research started, and, you know, digging in, I just began to realize, well, hang on, this is the Soviet montage era. It's known for editing montage. And there were just women everywhere in the edit suites, and they're all invisible. So I started to build on my work that was already to do with editing and rhythm, and started to take it into investigation of women and what we could learn from seeing the women who was making these inspiring edits. And I guess that's really, I suppose that's really what I want to say in the end. I guess part of what I'm saying is I didn't set out to make a trilogy. I only realized I was making a trilogy when I finished it. But there's a kind of an underlying sort of premise that comes out through all these films, which you've titled this session, Good Editing is Not Invisible. And when we talk about the Soviets, good editing really isn't invisible. And there's much more on that I could say on good editing isn't invisible, but I really also want to add to that, good editing is not invisible, and neither are the women who do it. And that's my manifesto. That's what I want to say with these three films.
There is a lot of issues that you tackle in these films. The political issues, feminist issues, and there is also this very intense focus on the editing itself, and that's probably where we should start. And I think the film that engages with editing most directly as a craft and also as an analytic, as a tool, is your film After the Fact. So at the time, as we know, there were different models of editing or montage put forward by different directors such as Eisenstein, Vertov, Kuleshov, Pudovkin. So for Kuleshov, as captured in The Famous, or maybe Infamous, as we will realize after watching your film, definition, Kuleshov effect, montage is about transcending limitations of time and space, of producing imaginary spaces, but also about allowing us to construct different readings of the same image depending on the contextual arrangements. For Vertov, montage is about rhythm primarily. And I want to quote from John Mackay's analysis of Vertov's strategies, because I think this is one of the best analysis on Vertov. And Mackay says by rhythm in Vertov films, he means a demonstratively rigorous patterning of film footage involving any number of configurations of difference and similarity. But what is important, why rhythm works for Vertov, it's because it mediates. And it mediates between free creativity and productive labor, but also between people as social beings, and indeed between human beings and non-human things. And rhythm has this capacity because it is a materialized form and transferable as pattern from one sphere of life to another. For instance, from the sphere of work to that of art and back again, without obliterating those spheres, without abolishing their differences. That's Vertov, according to Mackay. And for Eisenstein, montage is yet something else. It is about creating new ideas. It is very much about intellectual montage, about creating unrepresentable concepts from the collision and contradiction between separate images spliced together. And then there is also Esfir Shub, a far less familiar figure to general kind of readers and also many academics, who was an editor and director, and she is the principal character in your film After the Facts, and she also very significant for your film. I want to make a film about women. Against the trend of obliterating Shub and other female editors in the traditional account of the period of Soviet montage, your film After the Facts suggests that the contribution of female editors to Russian montage culture was far greater than traditional acknowledged. And you propose in this film to rename Kuleshov effect as the editor's effect, to pay homage to female editors erased by history. So I want to ask you first, which model of editing you find most inspiring, and whether we can see the film After the Facts, because I think this film illustrates beautifully principles of montage and how you put them in practice. So if we can see the film and you can comment or give us some insight on your take on montage, your take on editing.
The thing about Eisenstein and Vertov and Kuleshov, as you mentioned, they all had really quite different ideas about the power of montage. And I sort of see it more as them having different ideas about the powers of montage than montage itself, because what it turns out kind of after that Soviet period and into the present day in particular, all of their ideas have been absorbed and they're all being used all the time. So for me, my affinity is with Vertov and Svilova and their sense of rhythm and this idea of the human and the non-human and this great kind of dance that we're all engaged in and what Vertov in particular is trying to make montage do is to let us see the whole world in a sense as a kind of connected rhythmic entity that's sort of pumping away in this it's all about life, and it almost takes on a mystical plane for him, this rhythmic. So that's really easy for me. That's really close to my heart. With Eisenstein, the idea that it's sort of, I describe it as, as he might have 1 + 1 = 3. If you put two things together, and that will create a different idea. They don't, it's not just 1, 2 anymore. It's 1, 3. It's a whole new idea. And that, of course, is absolutely core. As all the editors here tonight will tell you, we do that. That is what we do. Otherwise, movies wouldn't make sense in some way. And then you do that to greater, you tax the viewer in greater and lesser amounts as you do that. So sometimes it simply makes sense. We put two things together and we get the impression that two people are having a conversation, for example. We get the impression of the conversation rather than the impression of one person talking and another person talking. Or you do it in much greater extent and you're actually making metaphors and really pushing your audience to make those connections. Kuleshov, interestingly, is one I know least about, and I'm just starting to investigate him more and feeling a bit bad, really, for crossing him out the way that I do in After the Facts, because he's a really creative and interesting guy. And I guess the reason that I want to do what I do in After the Facts and sort of reclaim the Kuleshov effect for the editor's effect, there's a few reasons, some of which I'll talk about in the movie, so I won't repeat them now. But I think what's really the thing that's not so well known about Kuleshov is that he really was a teacher, and he really, the thing that we call the Kuleshov experiment and the Kuleshov effect, it was actually like teaching materials that he was making. It's like he already knew he already knew these things existed, and he was demonstrating them in a way with these Kuleshov effects. So it's just kind of odd that they get named for him. And you know, as we'll see in the film, it becomes a problem for editors and for women in the way that this often happens, you know, with science, or doctors will name something for themselves because they've discovered it, but it just kind of erases the hundreds of people in their labs all over the world who are actually contributing to making something. So yeah, so in the movie After the Facts, you'll see some of this work of point of view editing, which is what is called the Kuleshov effect in some cases. You'll see some of this work of creating new ideas from juxtaposition, especially in the middle when I say Stalin wanted alternate facts, and then I just use a little juxtaposition technique to create a new idea. Not really saying Stalin wanted this, but you can sort of imagine. And then towards the end of the film, I really lean into this kind of more Vertovian montage of really connecting and rolling everybody together.
These images are facts. Film facts. Real images of real people, not staged or imagined. Facts. Facts become thoughts when you cut them together. Shot of a woman looking, shot of what she sees, shot of what she thinks. Shot of a woman looking, shot of what she sees, shot of what she thinks. She looks, she sees, she thinks. 3 facts made into a thought. Editing film facts into film thoughts is sometimes called the Kuleshov effect. But I think that is strange. In early cinema, most editors were women. Why would you name something lots of women and editors were doing after one man who observed them doing it? I'm reclaiming this and naming it the editor's effect. Esfir Shub was a filmmaker who told stories with the editor's effect. She is often credited with inventing the remix film. She wrote, "The intention was not so much to provide the facts, but to evaluate them from the vantage point of the revolutionary class." Esfir Shub and her colleagues Dziga Vertov and Elizaveta Svilova made films from facts. They had a vision for a huge room full of film facts, an archive, a mine for ideas about the world. But their political leader did not like their version of the facts. He wanted alternate facts. He wanted to see the Soviet Union as a musical. Shub did not want to make a musical. Shub and Vertov and Svilova wanted to make films about real women and real work. Shub wrote, "I wanted to make an image of the magnificent rhythms of work." They never got a chance to realize their visions. Stalin wanted to suppress their versions of the facts. The world wanted to suppress their versions of women. I think a lot about what their films would have been like. So I've mined films they did get to make. I've used their films as though they are rooms full of possible ideas about the world. These edits are my thoughts.
So in the chat, there's a link that is to, it's wfppcolumbia.edu.a, all of those numbers. That's after the facts. It's free, it's online. Anyone who wants to watch it anytime, head for that link. And then I've actually put two more, the clips we're gonna discuss, I've put links into the chat on those as well.
The link that Karen provided is the link to the actually very important database, Women Film Pioneer Project at Columbia University. And the film is also available as part of a special issue of In Transition, Journal of Videographic and Media Studies that I've put together in 2019. So it's available on several platforms. And when we were putting together this journal, we were very lucky to have Jane Gaines to comment on Karen's film. And I just want to read a short excerpt from Jane Gaines' commentary, because I think it's really illuminating. She says, in After the Facts, we have what feminist film theory never achieved in the 1970s, a theory of women's editing practice. Theorization in After the Facts is not only in Karen Pearlman's voice-over commentary, facts become thoughts, and these edits are my thoughts, but her theorization is in the cutting itself, is rhythmically pattern theory. After the Facts is about cutting to find and finding in the cut. It is a practiced theory, or even better, it is a creative practice of a theory of editing. And even more, After the Facts is a celebration of the theory and practice of creative cutting, itself exquisitely cut to draw attention to cut-on action technique using dancers in alternation with workers. After the Facts is not just a lesson in cutting, it is a lesson in how to see the cut. I think it is an amazing reflection on this film. And I want to ask Karen to share any thoughts she might have had about Jane Gaines' engagement with her work and analysis of her work, as well as to comment on this specific clip, which the link is provided in the chat, which we think Karen thinks really demonstrates her editing strategy.
So Julia curated the special issue of In Transition, where that review by Jane Gaines originally appeared, and the film was published. And so thank you for that, Julia. It was very significant for me to be featured in that issue that you put together on Soviet montage, and Eisenstein in particular. what Jane Gaines says about achieving what the feminist film scholars in the 70s were not able to achieve is well, it's really lovely of her to put it that way, and to say, you know, such a nice thing about my work. But what it's really pointing to, I think, is that the way that I am uncovering knowledge about women in film, in historically, and uncovering knowledge about editing is through creative practice. So I'm able to understand what those women were doing in the Soviet Union because I watched their films very closely, but much more so because I then try the techniques. I actually do them with my hands and with my editing gear and with filmed material. And that's another way of knowing, you know, and that's a way of knowing that editors listening will be very familiar with. It's like, we don't sort of say theory, we don't speak it, but we know what we're doing. A lot of times for editors, that that knowledge stays kind of below the surface of what we articulate, and it doesn't look like we're doing very much. So, you know, when they tried to theorize editing in the 70s, it just looked really boring. Like they couldn't see what anything, you know, there's nothing going on there. So it wasn't like they were running around and saying action and shooting a camera. It's just like, it doesn't look like anything. It looks very repetitive, but it's actually really complex. And there's a lot going on between our minds, our hands, our editing material, our editing gear. And that's stuff that never, ever, ever gets written down. So that's one of the reasons that these have you lost me there? Am I back?
Yeah, you're just breaking.
Okay, sorry. I gotta keep my hands in my lap. If I move too quickly, my internet fails. Women really dominated editing in the early years of cinema. And there's sort of a question that, you know, why they were allowed to stay in the edit suites when they were kicked out of almost everywhere else in film. And maybe it's because nobody realized just how complex editing is, like cognitively complex, or maybe they didn't realize how complex it is because women were doing it. And I think it's sort of interestingly circular there that, you know, women are doing this incredibly important, creative, complex creation of what we know to be film form, and nobody quite realizes it. So it's all very under the surface in that way.
Yeah, I think that leads us to your next film. And I think maybe in the interest of time, we skip the discussion of the clip that we were planning to do at this point, because I also want to, if you think we still have time, we can do this, but we also should allow for some questions after our conversations. So I think we might start talking about your first film, Women with an Editing Bench, and kind of address broader issues that your trilogy raises and your feminist rethinking of film history, which you've already started talking about. So Woman with an Editing Bench challenges conventional view on Vertov's work and gives due credit to his wife and collaborator, Elizaveta Svilova. And everything in this film is designed to disrupt the received account of Vertov's work, which pretty much aligns with the cult of auteur and turns Vertov, a man with a movie camera, into a figure solely responsible for the creative inventions and critical success of the film. And even the title, Woman with an Editing Bench, is a provocation. And you already alluded to this. But can you talk a little bit about this project before we zoom in on some specific sequences and images in this film?
So, I mean, the clip we're going to show from Woman with Knitting Bench is near the very end of it. And the problem that I had in trying to make Woman with Knitting Bench, a couple of really key issues. The first one, of course, is that that Svilova, the editor, she didn't write anything. There's no record of what she was thinking or what she was doing. So there's lots and lots of books about Vertov, lots and lots of his writing. He was very vocal. His newspaper articles, et cetera, and almost nothing about her. That's what got me thinking, okay, well, the edits are her thoughts. I'll just put the edits on screen. From there, I think that I had a really big problem with this film, which is that it's not fair for me to backwards apply my feminist perspective onto her. She did not feel like she was being sidelined. She felt like she was an equal partner with Vertov, and very possibly in the context, she was even more powerful than he was. She was a senior editor already when she was 19 years old. She started cutting when she was 10, right? She's a senior editor by the time she meets Vertov, and she really is. She's 22. She's running the whole editing department in the studio. He comes in with these little tiny bits of film that he wants cut together. The other editors laugh at him, throw them in the waste bin, and he's like crestfallen and brokenhearted. And she pulls them out of the bin and she puts them together and she really creates him. But it's not reasonable for me to put those words into her mouth or to say this is what she did. So in my film about her, I came up with I'm sort of using two devices. One is that from time to time, we see the montages that she is creating. So we go into black and white and we see the montages that she's creating. But we also use black and white in another way, which is to kind of see her thoughts, her premonitions about what's going to happen. And in the story that I'm telling in Woman with an Editing Bench, Vertov, how can I say this diplomatically? He really struggled with the studio. He was really like, give me what I need. What am I going to do? He was quite loud and forthright, and she on the other hand had ways of getting around the studio heads, and she almost could blackmail them. She was so skilled, like she could say, well, I'm not going to work on your project until you give Vertov what he needs, and so forth. So I guess what I've tried to put into the film Woman with an Editing Bench is this idea that she is literally editing to save his films and to save him. And so on this clip that I've just put in the chat, and it's probably easiest for you to just go to Vimeo and watch it from where you are, we come in near the end of the film, and what's happened is they've been kicked out of the edit suite by the studio boss, Boris. She's taken all the gear with her and she's snuck back in the middle of the night to finish the film. So you see her like starting to cut, you see what she is cutting, and then we kind of go into her head, into her premonition, where she kind of sees the future almost of what's likely to become of Vertov.
This is an amazing sequence. And what Karen said before, it comes to the essence of the collaboration between these two people, between Vertov and his wife. And this collaboration, the way it's presented in the film, it not only acknowledges the fact about which Karen feels very strongly, that Svilova effectively created Vertov as a director, materially, practically, created him and carried him through his life. And there is a lot of historical ground to kind of show and prove this. But the paradox of this early Russian collectivist culture is that it really forces us to think about collaborations in radically different ways, because even though the names of these women, like Svilova, like other editors, for example, Eisenstein's life-term editor, Esfir Shub, never mentioned. She was absolutely crucial to his success. But or Kuleshov's wife, Elizaveta Svilova, who was an actress, but also played a very important role in his creative career. The paradox is that these women didn't feel exploited and they didn't feel beaten. And even despite the fact that their presence was rarely acknowledged. And there is a lot to think about here. And one of the ways of accounting for these collaborations that Karen is suggesting, and I think a very productive way, is to think about them through the prism of cognitive theory. And Karen particularly favors the concept, the framework of distributed cognition. So that's how she theorizes the collaboration between Vertov and Svilova, and that proved to be one of the most enlightening way to understand their joint work. So I just wanted to ask you to comment on this and to give us a little bit of insight into the distributed cognition theory and how it relates to cinema practice.
Cool. I'm happy to do that. It's my little passion. I'm not going to lie. Okay, so distributed cognition. Let's just roll that back a little bit, because people kind of get like, when they hear the word cognition, like, what is that? I don't know. When we say cognition, a lot of people think it's like calculating or thinking in certain kind of very analytic ways. But in fact, cognition is a broad word. It covers a whole lot of things, including perceiving, judging, acting, feeling, valuing, remembering, like all the different things that we can think of that mind can do. They're kind of covered by when we say cognition. So, but here's the very cool thing is that what this distributed cognition philosophy is saying is that a mind isn't just in one person's brain. My mind is not just here between my ears. It's also in my body, which is something that I understand very well from having been a dancer, embodied cognition. And it's also in the world. So in a way, it's in the tools. And for a film editor, and again, I know everybody who's an editor here listening will understand this, you don't think just with your brain, you think with your hands, and you think with the filmed material, and you think with your gear. You don't kind of go, I think I'll make this edit, and then you go and make it. The edits, you and the material are thinking together. And then it extends just one step further to the sense that you and your collaborators are thinking together. So you might be thinking together through the material that cinematographer shot and the director directed and so on. And or you might literally be in the edit suite kind of like thinking together, like finishing each other's sentences, and sort of like, the director will go, so wait, but you, yeah, it's like nobody's actually making any full sentences, but you're understanding each other and you're thinking together and editing together. And I'm confident that we can say that was going on with Vertov and Svilova. I mean, they were married. She understood him. he, you know, awakened some capacities in her. She does talk about this, that she had no other chance to explore with other directors. And so this is a, you know, this is a really connected cognition way. But I think that it helps us to understand something that Julia was talking about before, that's really quite unique to that time and place in the Soviet Union, which is this kind of connectedness of mission, I guess you would almost say. It's like they weren't like the idea that we have that, you know, it's going to be a star, and like Quentin Tarantino is an author and so forth. This wasn't really their idea. It was more like that working was valued, and working harmoniously together was valued. And so this was in itself the value, and the kind of the doing and the making was the thing, and not the kind of being lauded for it. Although, you know, I think figures like Vertov and Eisenstein were not free of ego either. You know, I think we can't really say, oh, it's just completely ego-free Soviet. You know, they were stung by lack of recognition. We know that much, so we must know they wanted recognition in some ways. Whereas you don't get that sense about Svilova or about Esfir Shub in exactly the same way, that they were so stung when they were not recognized. They just wanted to work, you know, and that's what I really bring out in my film. And I just want to say, and we'll move on to a film about the last clip and a film about women in a second, but I just want to say about Man with the Movie Camera is a mistranslation. And I didn't learn this until quite a bit later, but it's kind of important to understanding the whole Soviet connection idea, and the way that women weren't kind of deliberately buried necessarily. But Man with a Movie Camera should, as I understand it, translate to person with a cinema apparatus. Now, I don't think that's going to sell a lot of DVDs. Oh, let's sit down and watch Person with a Cinema Apparatus.
Exactly. This the pun that of the title, Woman with an Editing Bench, it only works in English, because in Russian it's not man, it's a human being, and it's not gendered. Yeah. So this the gender inflection of the title is only a kind of a phenomenon of translation, but it didn't exist in its original version. So, but yeah, in the English-speaking world, it totally works.
But what's interesting, what that really interestingly points to for me, is that history is constructed, it's made, it's received, it's a story we tell. So, you know, I grew up with Man with a Movie Camera. I never, you know, I didn't learn Russian until well, I still don't know Russian, but I know a few words, and I know that word, you know, so 5 years ago, which is, but I have this received history, and the received history gets kind of, I don't know, it transforms in weird ways as it gets passed from one person to the next. And so this idea that it's Man with a Movie Camera, and I think Vertov would have been appalled by the idea that he was the creator. He never uses the word I. It's always like we. So yeah, it's interesting.
But yeah, as we said, it just probably opens up a space a little bit to think about this gender distribution of labor in terms of alternatives, which are not limited to reversal, to giving women the leading, dominant role, and to kind of relegating men to the background. Even though this is pretty much what your next film does. At least visually. So the next film, the last film in the trilogy, is called I Want to Make a Film About Women. And this refers back to what Shub was saying, and Karen already talked about this in After the Facts. And I also just want to kind of acknowledge that we were on the research trip to gather materials for this film. I want to make a film about women a few years ago in Moscow when traveling was still possible. And we had amazing time in Russian archives digging out those precious little snippets of information that eventually went into this film, and as well as some purely random occasions of encountering work of other artists, which I think was equally important for the film inception and execution. So this film continues to explore Esfir Shub's legacy, and it also brings in other women who played significant role in early Russian film culture and artistic culture more generally. So it brings in Lilia Brik, who is probably most famous as Vladimir Mayakovsky's muse, and also brings in Varvara Stepanova, an amazing design artist. And I think the design of the costumes and the set design in your film is very much inspired by Stepanova's work. And in the first instance, your film makes a very powerful statement that these women were the real driving force behind the explosion of creativity that was named by some film critics and art critics as the Great Russian Experiment. And in this film, male figures are always kept in the background, and sometimes they're placed in the closet, while women are given material, literal presence on the screen. So can you show us how you've done this and talk about your strategy in this film a little bit? I'm not sure whether we'll be able to see any clips, but maybe you can describe your strategy.
First of all, I also want to acknowledge that Julia took me to Moscow. I mean, this would not have happened without her. So that's really important. You know, there I was, and you go to an archive in Moscow and there are armed guards at the door, and you go to, Julia like took me by the arm and brought me through all of that. So thank you for that, Julia. And then to say that, while I was there, I guess what this third film does is try to bring it all together. It tries to bring together the idea that people were thinking together, that they were not writing things down as men. The women were not writing down manifestos or putting them in archives. And the image that I try to create is of the unspoken, of stuff that isn't in the archives. So it's called a speculative documentary, and I have to say it's not a documentary about them. It's a documentary about me. Really, it's everything I say about them is true, and it comes from my archival research, or it's my actual thoughts. It's what I'm thinking or wondering or so forth. But what you see on the screen, it never happened. I absolutely 100% promise you, when you watch this clip, it didn't happen. But because the performers are so committed, and for various reasons, you feel like you're watching something that is happening. So this is the tension that I'm trying to create. And this, in a way, is going back to Eisenstein's idea about creating a third idea through juxtaposition. There's this juxtaposition of what I'm saying and of what you're seeing. And it leaves you with this tension to try to work it out yourselves. So there are 5 sort of sequences in this film. 4 of them are only women, and this is what we're going to watch, the one that's called Reel 3 Men. And gosh, what can I say? I think let's have a look at it, and then you can ask me questions about it. So the women are, yeah, I think it's pretty much explains itself. So let's just go have a look at it.
Так, хватит, не надо меня снимать.
Shub was friends with men, too. Men who are remembered as great filmmakers.
Привет,
Eisenstein,
Сереженька,
Vertov.
заходи.
Shub and Vertov respected each other deeply, and they were both frustrated in their efforts to make a film about women. As for Eisenstein, well, he was a fiction filmmaker and she was strictly documentary. But she did consult on his scripts, and she did teach him to edit. Here, in her kitchen. Who knows what he learned from her? Vertov and Eisenstein had huge public disputes over method. But Shub managed to stay friends with both these filmmakers. I don't know how she did that. But I do know she probably never did this. And she certainly never did this. Though, I guess you could say it's kind of what history did to her.
Very cheeky.
Yeah, I think it's just like in A Woman with an Editing Bench. There is what you do, you're using some narrative devices and some visual devices, and you play with some narrative possibilities. And you also create very apt visual metaphors to make your points.
And audio ones. I mean, we did this whole thing with the soundtrack, because the woman playing Esfir Shub, Victoria Haralabidu, she was born in Moscow, and she left the Soviet Union when she was 15, and then she went back and she went to film school there, to VIC. So that was the film school where Esfir Shub taught, and she went to that film school. So she really took a lot, like she just embodies that character and really pulls it off. But she's speaking in Russian because she speaks Russian. She's native Russian. And I actually only kind of know what she's saying. I mean, I kind of know what she's saying, but you probably understand her, Julia, but I do not. But the two men that I cast as Eisenstein and Vertov, they obviously don't speak any Russian. They're Australians. And I didn't really want them to speak. I mean, we've heard a lot from them. They speak a lot and there's a lot that they have said that we can find. So I made Vertov's voice is a train, all those train sounds. Every time he speaks, you hear some kind of clacking of a train or something like that. And that was kind of aligned in my mind with his obsession with trains and his work on trains and his love of trains and the mechanical and everything. And then when you hear Eisenstein speak, he's a trumpet. So there was a little bit of a sense of he had this kind of ability to trumpet himself that I was bringing out, and the two of them really clash. Anyway, so it's visual and audio metaphors that I'm making about them, and in a way, yeah, it's cheeky.
Yeah. I think you even didn't light them very well. I don't think they're in the shadow, sort of.
Well, I mean,
that was in my memory.
I was frustrated. I was frustrated because, like everybody gets taught Vertov and Eisenstein. I did it myself for years when I was head of screen studies. I would teach Eisenstein and Vertov because that's the received history. But Esfir Shub literally taught Eisenstein to edit in her kitchen. And he acknowledges that at various points, what he learned from her about putting things together. But his is the theory that we study and learn, not hers. And I guess, it was frustrating. It is frustrating. It's frustrating. It just doesn't need to be that way. And so in a way, you kind of have to do something quite outrageous and cheeky and assertive in order to disrupt that historical narrative and see if it can be, adjusted in some way.
And it's just recently that it came up, this fact about Eisenstein and Shub working together, and Eisenstein having his first experience of filmmaking with Shub. re-editing Dr. Mabuse, the Gambler, for Soviet release, because at the time, foreign films had to be recut rather radically. So radically as to change the narrative arc and to change the ideological message. So this film had to become a condemnation of the West. And that's what they did, Shub and Eisenstein. The copy hasn't survived, unfortunately, but there is a copy of the subtitles, and it kind of demonstrates the extent of how radically this film was recut. So, and that was, for Eisenstein, that was his first experience of cutting, and he remained deeply grateful to Shub and carried throughout his life a lot of respect for her and admiration for her craft.
I think what kind of ultimately comes out through that story and through all the stories is that editing, it really isn't one person who comes up with stuff, you know. So there's this whole industry in the Soviet Union of bringing in foreign films and recutting them to have strong Soviet messages, revolutionary messages, rather than strong capitalist messages, which all films from America just do. That's their message. So they recut them, and it's like, through that process, through that industry, a lot of people really came to understand the power of editing, of what you could do by putting images together differently, of really transforming them to tell a different story. So it's kind of like, you know, we don't need to go, oh, it's all Shub. And that's why back in After the Facts, I don't go, it's the Shub effect. It's not the Shub effect. It's the editor's effect. It's, yeah.
So speaking about editing, and apart from narrative kind of moves and visual and sound metaphors, of course, editing is one of your absolutely prime tools of work. And just focusing on your last film, there is this sequence where you use 3 different takes of a kiss and edit them together. And that's kind of a demonstration of your craft, right? So what are you trying to say there? And I'm not sure whether we can see this sequence.
Yeah. Look, I mean,
okay.
I think we might have to jump over this one, Julia. Just my internet is so faulty, and it's also getting quite late. So
okay,
I'd be sort of more like happy to open it up to see if people wanted to ask me questions. I'll just, you know, while people are thinking of questions they might have about editing or Soviets or why we do this crazy stuff or why I talk so much, if I think I'm going to be an editor or whatever, any questions you have is fine with me. So when we were in Russia together, I had a few different opportunities to meet with film historians and film theorists there. And some of them that I met with were men, you know, in their 60s, and some of them I met with were young women in their 20s. And, you know, there's just a whole kind of different range of things. But one thing that I kept being asked while I was in Moscow was whether or not Esfir Shub was gay. And I was like, why are you asking me this? I found it really interesting because when the men in their 60s would ask me this question, it was like, yeah, but she wasn't really a woman, really? Was she? She was gay, wasn't she? It was like, you know, this kind of like they were trying to do something, you know, kind of unsettling with that idea. And then these young women, and actually more like after I left, after Moscow, when I was in California later in the year, and, you know, women would come to me and say, but yeah, Esfir Shub, she was gay, wasn't she? And they were like trying to own this thing. And so I thought, yeah, I mean, it's a moment that comes up in the film where Esfir Shub and Lilia Brik kissed, which historically, as far as we know, would never have happened. Maybe it could have happened. I don't know. You know what I mean? But
it
basically,
could have happened, but it's another question what that would mean, because I think what this question kind of indicates, and I'm asked a lot about Eisenstein's sexuality, and it's a perennial question whether he was gay. And the interesting point, I think, here is similar with collaboration, that Eisenstein's example, at least, I'm not so sure about Shub, forces us to think about sexuality in a more fluid terms, even that the dichotomy of straight gay kind of. It's and it's even beyond queer. Avant la lettre, it's really a different kind of very fluid, very
and that's exactly the point that I try to make in a film about women, and is that why are you asking? It's a really what's it when something is chronologically incorrect? It's not asynchronous. It's anyway, it's not a question. The way we ask it now, the way we ask that question would not have made any sense at the time. It would, or you know, it was like, why do you, the way that these two different people want to know whether or not she's gay has to do with a whole lot of ideas about sexuality and politics of sexuality and on that just would not have been part of the discourse, I don't think. And yeah, that was my definite impression from watching Shub's films and from seeing photos of her, the way that they were being creative kind of body to body in a different,
Okay, so we have two questions. One is about your last film, where it will be available for general viewing, I guess. It's been screened at several festivals so far.
Yeah, it was actually available. I should have sort of given everyone the heads up. It was playing on a dance film festival in Victoria for most of July and August online. I don't know next when it will be online, but within about a year or so, we're working on a deal with Ronin to basically release the trilogy as a series that you should be able to buy or rent on Vimeo or play in Classroom or something like that. So it's not available online yet. It's still going to festivals. It's still winning awards even. I mean, it just won an award, a really glorious award from the Victorian Multicultural Film Festival just last week, which is really lovely.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So another question is, are there any filmmakers more recently who are doing interesting things with montage editing in view of you?
So, Julie, when you say montage there, I'm thinking you're using it in the way that we use that word in English. So in French and in Russian, it just means editing. So you could say, are you asking, is anyone doing any interesting editing? Or maybe you're asking about this kind of particular style of editing. So in English, when we say montage, we usually mean something that is not continuous in time and space. It's the association of things that are discontinuous in order to make metaphors or make rhythms or something like that. Look, there's lots of interesting editing going on out there. I would first of all just say, hello, Jill Bilcock. Hello, Margaret Slicksel, go there. They're doing really interesting things with editing. They're really incredible, some of the most empowered and really lively and imaginative editors in the world are those two women who are both Australian women. So let's go there. And then I guess I would say, you never know. You never know when you're just going to stumble on something and go, oh, wow, that was really fresh, what somebody did with their editing. And that's pretty much where I would leave it. I'd say, just watch a lot of movies. There's some interesting stuff going on. I really don't like the word experimental, so I don't want to point to films that are experimenting with editing. It's like more like they're just finding the thing that film could be. And that's, to me, is interesting montage.
We have two more questions from Chloe and Tamara, and they are a little bit similar. They are about your career and inspiration. So probably we'll start with this one first. What really pushed you to go for this career, and what continues to motivate you to create? This is
oh gosh, Holly.
question.
Well, so the part of the story that I left out is I was a dancer, right? And when you're a dancer at this kind of professional level that I was dancing at, you don't really decide to be a dancer. You start dancing when you're 4, and then, you know, if it works, you're dancing still when you're 34. And then you kind of go, okay, you know what, that's enough of that. Or the world goes, okay, you know what, that's enough of that, one way or the other. That's what happens. So then here I am, I'm 35 years old, and I'm going, oh, what am I going to be when I grow up? And what I was looking for was some way to use what I call my accrued kinesthetic intelligence, which is the kind of ability to think in movement that I had gotten over those 30 years of dancing. And editing is what I landed on. And it still is, you know, for all my politics and all my, you know, cleverness or research, any of it, it's still that sense of movement that inspires me. And I'll get my hands on anything. A colleague of mine asked me to cut his dance film for him, and it was just like heaven for me. It's just like, oh yes, cutting dance film, that's what I was born to do. But I don't do it very often. But yeah, it moves me in a way that that very little else does. So that's what motivates me to keep going at this point.
Karen, that's so interesting because dance is cut so badly in film, Hollywood films anyway. They don't continue the whole movement until it's resolved. They're just going from one thing to another all the time. It's so poorly done.
Yeah. Look, I think it varies a lot. I mean, if I would recommend, if you want to see an incredibly brilliant editing, look at Cabaret. Have you watched Cabaret lately? It's through the roof, so smart. But I love that editing that goes quick. I talk a lot about Chicago and the way that they'll take a 3-second movement phrase and turn it into 7 shots, and it's making a new movement phrase. It's not the dance as it was performed, it's cinema. It's doing something else altogether. And that to me is the creative bit. I mean, out of my dance career, I wasn't really a great choreographer, but I'm gonna say it. I'm a good editor. I edit dance well because that's where I can see the creation of those movement phrases.
That's amazing. And I think it sounds so topical right now, because we have this great move in film theory towards embodiment, and in lots of other humanity disciplines towards embodied perspective. And your trajectory is just such a brilliant illustration of how much this embodied intellect is important, how much it can do for you.
Look, I mean, it's very nice of you to say so, Julia, but I have to say, I was very, very poorly educated. I mean, I'll put that another way. I danced. I mean, as a teenager, I barely went to high school. I'm surprised they let me out in the end, because I just was off dancing all the time. So that's the education that I had. And when I quit dancing, I actually did 3 postgraduate degrees I did 2 master's degrees and a PhD in 8 years. But what kind of surprised and amazed me when I started to do more, reading into ideas about mind and ideas about creativity was that people ever thought that thinking wasn't embodied. Like, that was really hard for me to get my head around. Like, what do you mean embodied cognition? Of course it's embodied. What do you mean? It took me a while to figure out that they had some idea that it wasn't embodied, that they felt was supportable somehow. But for me, it's always been, and yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I think we need to answer this last question from Chloe about where to start in terms of film history. I think given this conversation, we would say start with Soviet montage theory and practice, but you might have other ideas.
Look, I think it's actually, I mean, let me put it this way, Chloe, you're a bit early because there are women and film historians and film theorists all over the world who are kind of going, wait a minute, this story that there was a man named D.W. Griffith who invented all of this stuff, this is just not accurate. There are lots of historians and theorists coming around to this idea that, well, in fact, things in the film industry, film evolves from a very distributed process. This little thing happens over here, this thing happens over there. There might be 7 people around the world simultaneously who go, hey, if I cut when she looks, it'll seem like she's looking at whatever I cut to. Like, this is just happening all over the world all the time in history. But the telling of the story of history and theory is taking a while to catch up. But we're working on it. There's this Mark Cousins series called, does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Story of film.
It's a story of film that's very, very inspiring to watch. He gets a lot of stuff slightly wrong, but okay, whatever. And then he made another version of it a few years later, which is focusing on women filmmakers and how they changed through the industry. So those are both interesting series to watch to kind of get a sense of some of the breadth of the world. The good thing about Mark Cousins is he is very multicultural. Like, he's not just focused on American films. He's, you know, it's African films and Japanese films and Russian films. He's got the whole picture going on. Doesn't get everything right, but it's very inspiring to watch anyway, because he uses a lot of clips. So.
Okay, we have one more question, but we also have 1 minute to conclude our session. So I think this is a very technical question and probably requiring a rather long answer and conversation.
I can
So
tell you
we'll
this.
leave it.
I can tell you this, Angie. Try breathing with your edit, and when the breath doesn't flow, the edit's not flowing, and that's when to cut. You know, it's you don't need to cut until it loses its hold on you. So I'm a very short, sharp person. I'm barely 5 feet tall. I talk really fast. I cut really fast. That doesn't work. There are lots of people who should not hire me to be their editor because why not cut when you can cut is my attitude. So, but there are lots of, it's about the material and throwing the energy at the right time from one shot to the next to get the energy to flow across the whole film. Otherwise, I wrote a book on it, so you can get the rest from that. How about that?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much, Karen. That's another example of this embodied perspective on the craft of editing. Yeah. Use your breath as a guide. That's amazing. Thank you so much. So thank you once again for POP and Women in Film Festival, and such a big thank to Karen for sharing her insights and sharing her wonderful films with us. They're really, this is an intervention in film history, and this is great. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Karen, and I think on this note we'll close our session. Thanks, everyone.